When Elena Vidal, 32, signed the divorce papers without shedding a single tear in front of the man who had humiliated her for 7 years of marriage, Alejandro Mendoza thought he had won. He thought she would leave empty-handed, destroyed, to cry in some miserable apartment while he celebrated his freedom with his 25-year-old mistress. What Alejandro didn't know was that this quiet woman, this wife he had treated as invisible, held a secret that would shake the foundations of his arrogance. 3 weeks after the divorce, gossip magazines across Spain exploded with photographs of Elena leaving Madrid's most exclusive boutiques on the arm of Marcos Rivero, one of the country's wealthiest businessmen. And when Alejandro saw those photos, when he discovered who the man beside his ex-wife really was, the color drained from his face, because fate has a peculiar way of collecting debts. And Elena Vidal was about to prove that the silence of a wounded woman can be more powerful than 1,000 cries for vengeance. If you're ready for this story, comment where you're watching from. The lawyer's office smelled of expensive leather and ambition. The walls were lined with books probably never read, framed diplomas proclaiming academic achievements, and photographs with politicians and businessmen validating the firm's status. It was the kind of place where destinies were decided with the coldness of a bank transaction, where marriages were dissolved with the same efficiency as million-euro contracts were signed. Elena Vidal sat in a beige leather chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap, with a calm that unsettled everyone present. She wore a simple pale pink dress that highlighted her slender figure, dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore no jewelry except her wedding band. The one that in minutes would cease to have meaning. Her face was a mask of serenity, her brown eyes fixed on the documents before her, revealing no emotion. Across the polished mahogany table, Alejandro Mendoza watched her with arms crossed and an expression of poorly disguised boredom. He was an attractive 38-year-old, blonde hair slicked back with gel, perfectly trimmed beard, dark Italian designer suit. Everything about him screamed money and success. From the Swiss watch on his wrist to the gold cufflinks at his sleeves. He was the financial director of a major Madrid construction company, a position that had provided a lifestyle he considered deserved and that his wife, in his opinion, had never appreciated. 7 years of marriage were ending in that room with the same lack of ceremony with which they had passed. Alejandro vaguely remembered their wedding day. An intimate ceremony at a courthouse, because Elena had no family to invite and he hadn't wanted to spend money on something he considered an unnecessary formality. She had arrived in a white dress bought on sale, her eyes bright with hope and love. He had arrived thinking about the work meeting he had that afternoon. From the beginning, Elena had been invisible to him. He'd met her in a cafe near his office, where she worked as a waitress while studying graphic design in her free time. She was pretty in a subtle way, not flashy, the kind of beauty that grows on you over time, rather than striking immediately. Alejandro had noticed her because he needed someone to take care of his apartment, prepare his dinners, be available when he wanted company. Marriage had been a convenience, a way to have a presentable wife without the effort of maintaining a real relationship. And Elena had played her role perfectly for 7 years. She had abandoned her studies when he told her they made no sense. Why waste time on something that would never make money? She had left her job when he decided it didn't look good for his wife to serve coffee. She had become the perfect shadow, always present but never bothersome, always available but never demanding. Alejandro had never bothered to really know her. He didn't know her favorite color, what music she liked, what she dreamed about when she looked out the window with that distant expression he mistook for emptiness. He didn't know that Elena read poetry at night while he slept, that she drew in notebooks hidden at the back of the closet, that she cried silently in the bathroom when he ignored her for entire days. What Alejandro did know was that he was bored with her. 2 years ago he had begun his affair with Sofia, an intern at his company 20 years younger. Sofia was everything Elena was not: loud, demanding, ambitious. She made him feel young and powerful. He didn't care that Elena had discovered the messages, the hotel receipts, the perfumes not hers on her husband's shirts. In fact, it had almost been a relief when she finally confronted him 3 months ago, with trembling voice and tear-filled eyes. He had expected screams, broken plates, threats. Instead, Elena had simply asked if he wanted a divorce. And when he answered yes, that it was best for both of them, she had silently nodded and gone to sleep in the guest room. They hadn't spoken of it again until today. Alejandro's lawyer, a balding, sweaty man who charged €500 an hour, explained the terms of the agreement with barely contained satisfaction. Elena asked for nothing, not the house, not alimony, not a share of the savings. She only wanted to leave with her clothes and her books. Elena's lawyer, a young recent graduate she'd found online, seemed uncomfortable with the situation but said nothing. Alejandro couldn't believe his luck. He had expected a battle. He had prepared arguments about why she deserved nothing. He had even hired a detective to dig up dirt he could use against her. But Elena didn't fight. Elena simply signed each page placed before her in elegant, unhurried handwriting, without looking up, without showing emotion. When she finished signing the last document, Elena removed her wedding band and placed it on the table with a soft metallic clink. Alejandro watched the gesture with a mixture of relief and something he didn't want to identify as guilt. She stood, gathered her bag, and for the first time in the entire meeting, looked him directly in the eyes. There was no hatred in that look. No pain or resentment. There was something Alejandro couldn't interpret, something that seemed almost like compassion, as if she knew something he didn't. And then, without a word of goodbye, Elena Vidal walked out of the office and out of his life. Alejandro leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. It had been easier than expected. Now he was free to live his life as he wished, without the dead weight of a boring wife. Sophia waited for him at his apartment with champagne and future plans. Everything was perfect. What Alejandro didn't know, couldn't even imagine, was that Elena Vidal was not the insignificant woman he believed he knew, and the coming weeks would show him just how wrong he had been for 7 long years. Elena left the firm and walked 3 blocks before allowing herself to breathe. For the first time in 7 years, she was completely free. She took out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The call was brief. "It's done. Everything is finished." 10 minutes later, a black Mercedes stopped beside her. Elena's story was far more complex than Alejandro had ever bothered to discover. She was born in a small Galician village, daughter of a single mother. She never knew her father. Her mother died when she was 18, leaving her alone with €300 in her pocket. She moved to Madrid, and in her loneliness, met Alejandro. Marriage had been an escape from precarity that turned out to be another prison. But a year ago, among old boxes, Elena found a letter from a man named Rafael Vidal, dated before her birth. In it, Rafael promised to return for her and the baby they were expecting. The letter was never sent. Rafael had died in Argentina 3 months later, without knowing he had a daughter. Elena investigated and discovered that Rafael had a younger brother, Marcos Rivero Vidal, today one of Spain's richest men, owner of luxury hotels and wineries in La Rioja. 6 months ago, she had written him a letter explaining who she was. The response came in person. Marcos appeared at a cafe, a 50-year-old man with the same brown eyes as hers. He brought photo albums, stories of Rafael, tears from an uncle discovering he wasn't alone. Since then, he had become the family Elena never had, and it was he who gave her the courage to ask for divorce. The Mercedes stopped in La Moraleja. Marcos waited with open arms. Elena finally allowed herself to cry. That night, he offered her an apartment, a job at his hotel company, the opportunity to resume her studies, not as charity, but as the inheritance her father would have wanted to leave her. Elena accepted with one condition: no one should know of their family connection. She wanted to start over on her own merits. One Saturday in May, uncle and niece decided to go shopping to celebrate the first month of Elena's new life. What they didn't notice was the paparazzo who had been following them from the parking lot. The photographs sold that night. The headline: Marcos Rivero caught with his mysterious new love. The photos showed evident intimacy. Him carrying bags, her laughing, a kiss on the cheek that seemed like something more. Social media exploded. Some called her a gold digger. Others celebrated that Spain's most eligible bachelor had found love. Alejandro found out in the worst way. Sofia was flipping through a magazine during breakfast when she gasped. Elena's face stared at him from the cover, but it was an Elena he didn't recognize: red dress, shiny hair, radiant smile. She looked alive in a way she never had during their marriage. And beside her was Marcos Rivero, the same man whose company had rejected him for a directorial position, the same man who was a VIP client of his construction firm, the same man whose wealth exceeded 500 million euros. Alejandro's blood boiled. It wasn't jealousy, he told himself, because he didn't love Elena. It was the feeling of having been deceived by that insignificant woman who had accepted divorce without asking for anything. That night, he texted her asking if it was true, if she had been seeing Rivero while they were married. The response came 20 minutes later, brief and devastating: "My life is no longer your concern. I wish you well." Alejandro didn't sleep that night, and the coming weeks would be much worse. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Elena. After the media explosion, she and Marcos decided it was time to reveal the truth. They called a press conference at the Rivero Hotel's headquarters, where Marcos introduced Elena not as his romantic partner, but as what she really was: his niece, the daughter of his brother Rafael. The revelation was a bombshell that eclipsed the previous headlines. Media went crazy searching for information about Rafael Vidal, about Elena's mother, about how the heir to one of Spain's largest fortunes could have had a secret daughter. The story was irresistible. The orphan who discovers she's heir to an empire, the modern Cinderella who didn't need a prince because she had her own story. Elena handled the media attention with a grace that surprised even Marcos. She gave only one interview to a respected journalist, telling her story with honesty but without victimhood. She spoke of her mother with love, of her father with curiosity and forgiveness for the circumstances that separated him from her, of her difficult years in Madrid. Without mentioning Alejandro by name. When asked about her failed marriage, she simply said, "Some experiences teach us who we don't want to become." For Alejandro Mendoza, each news item was renewed humiliation. His colleagues looked at him with a mix of mockery and amazement. How could he have divorced Marcos Rivero's niece without knowing it? How had he let slip away a woman who turned out to be heir to hundreds of millions? The questions pursued him everywhere. In his office, whispers stopped as he passed, but never fast enough. His boss, who had always treated him with distant respect, now looked at him with something like disappointment. After all, Marcos Rivero was one of the construction company's most important clients, and the man who had mistreated his niece worked right there. Sofia didn't help. What had started as an exciting affair had become a tense coexistence, full of reproaches. She demanded attention and gifts he could no longer afford so generously, now that he was living alone in an overpriced apartment. She threw in his face that he had let a millionaire go for her, as if he could have known something not even Elena herself had revealed. But the worst was yet to come. A month after the press conference, Alejandro received a call from Human Resources. He was asked to report to the meeting room on the executive floor. When he arrived, he found his boss, the HR director, and a company lawyer waiting with somber expressions. They explained that Rivero Hotels had terminated all contracts with the construction company. No official reasons were given, but the message was clear. And although the company couldn't fire him solely for that, the restructuring that would follow the loss of such an important client meant his position was expendable. They offered him a severance package and the option to resign voluntarily to avoid tarnishing his resume. Alejandro signed the papers with trembling hands, the irony of the situation burning inside him. He had made Elena sign divorce documents, leaving her with nothing. Now he was the one signing his own sentence. He left the building with a cardboard box containing his personal belongings, the afternoon sun mocking his misery. He had nowhere to go. The apartment he shared with Sofia was hers, paid for by her parents. His savings had dwindled between ostentatious expenses and maintaining a life he could no longer afford. For the first time in his life, Alejandro Mendoza felt invisible, and he hated every second of it. The months that followed were the hardest of Alejandro's life. Sofia left him when it became clear he could no longer maintain the lifestyle she expected. He moved in with his parents on the outskirts of Madrid. A humiliation he never thought he'd suffer. He sent hundreds of resumes, but his reputation preceded him. No one wanted to hire the man who had angered Marcos Rivero. Meanwhile, Elena flourished. Her work as a designer at Rivero Hotels had attracted attention for her genuine talent, not her surname. She had redesigned the suites of 2 boutique hotels with a style that design magazines called fresh and sophisticated. She resumed her graphic design studies at university, attending night classes with the same determination she'd had at 18. But more important than professional success was the personal transformation. Elena had found her voice, the one Alejandro had silenced for 7 years. She spoke with confidence, laughed without permission, occupied space without apology. She had begun writing poetry again, and some of her poems were published in a small literary magazine. Nothing grand, but hers. She had also found love, though not with anyone expected. Daniel Ortega was the director of a hotel in Barcelona, where Elena had gone to supervise a renovation. He wasn't a millionaire or famous, just an honest 40-year-old man who looked at her as if she were the most interesting person in the world. They met arguing about wall colors and ended up having dinner together, then breakfast, then not wanting to be apart. Daniel didn't know who Marcos Rivero was when he met Elena. He didn't care when he found out. He loved her for how she wrinkled her nose when something amused her, for the notes she left in book margins, for the way she lost herself in thought looking at the sea, things Alejandro had never bothered to notice. A year after the divorce, Elena and Daniel announced their engagement. The wedding would be small and intimate at an estate on the Galician coast, near the village where Elena grew up. Marcos would walk her down the aisle in place of her absent father. Only close family and true friends were invited. Alejandro found out through social media, like everyone else. He saw the announcement photos, Elena radiant in a simple dress, embraced by a man who looked at her with genuine adoration. The photo's caption spoke of second chances and finding someone who sees your light, even when you've forgotten it yourself. Something broke inside Alejandro that night. It wasn't love for Elena, that he knew. It was the belated understanding of everything he had wasted, not just her as a person, but the opportunity to be someone different, someone better. He had spent 7 years with an extraordinary woman and had treated her like furniture. He had had the chance to grow, to learn, to truly love, and had thrown it away for an ego that now served him nothing. For the first time in his life, Alejandro cried. He cried for the person he could have been and never was. He cried for the lost years and wasted opportunities. He cried because he finally understood that karma wasn't a punishment, it was a mirror, and the reflection he saw was devastating. He didn't try to contact Elena. He knew he had no right. But in the solitude of his childhood bedroom, he did something he had never done. He honestly reflected on his actions, not to justify himself, but to understand. And in that painful process, he found the first seeds of something like redemption. 2 years after the divorce, Elena Vidal stood before the mirror of a small hotel on the Galician coast, adjusting her wedding veil, one her mother would have loved. Through the window, she saw the Cantabrian Sea, the same sea that had marked her childhood of poverty but also of unconditional love. Today she was marrying Daniel, and her heart was so full she could barely contain it. Marcos entered the room with moist eyes, telling her Rafael would be proud, her mother would be proud, that he was more proud than words could express. Elena hugged him for a long time, grateful for the family fate had returned to her in the most unexpected way. The ceremony was simple and emotional. The guests were few, but each meant something real in Elena's life. Colleagues who had become friends, neighbors from the village who remembered her as a child, Daniel's family who had welcomed her as their own. No press or magazine photographers, just genuine moments captured by the phones of those who loved them. When Daniel and Elena exchanged vows, she spoke of how she had learned that true love doesn't make you invisible but helps you shine. She spoke of second chances and the courage to start over. She spoke of gratitude for a path that, though painful, had brought her exactly where she needed to be. Daniel promised to always see her, always listen to her, remind her of her worth every day the world tried to make her forget. He promised to be her companion in storms and on sunny days, to build a life where both could grow without losing themselves. Among the guests, no one noticed the absence of Alejandro Mendoza. No one mentioned him or thought of him. He had finally become what he had always made Elena feel, invisible. But the story doesn't end there. 3 years after the wedding, Elena received a letter. There was no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Alejandro. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or a second chance. It didn't try to justify what he had done. It simply told his story. It told of spending 2 years in therapy, confronting demons he never knew he had. It told of finding work in a small family business, far from the corporate world that had fed the worst in him. It told of learning what it meant to be invisible and finally understanding, though late, the damage he had caused. He wished her genuine happiness. He thanked her, though it sounded absurd, for teaching him the most important lesson of his life, even if that lesson came through the pain he himself had caused. And he ended with a promise to be better. Not for her, but for himself and for anyone who crossed his path in the future. Elena read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in a box where she kept other important letters, her father's to her mother, Daniel's first love notes, her own wedding invitation. She didn't respond. There was no need. Some stories don't end with vengeance or dramatic reconciliation. They end with the silence of someone who has found peace and no longer needs the past to validate their present. Elena had built a life full of love, purpose, and joy. She had a husband who adored her, an uncle who protected her, work she was passionate about, and finally, a 2-year-old daughter with the same brown eyes of 3 generations of Vidals. She had learned that the best kind of justice isn't the one that destroys another, but the one that allows you to build something beautiful from the ashes of what was destroyed. And every morning when the Galician sun streamed through the window of her house by the sea, Elena smiled, knowing that the silence with which she had accepted that divorce had not been defeat. It had been the first step toward the life she had always deserved. If this story made you believe that happy endings exist for those with the courage to start over, leave a heart below so I know. And if you truly want to support stories like this, about real people with real hearts in a world that often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a small thank you from the heart through the super thanks function below. Every gesture counts. Just like Elena's silence counted more than 1,000 words. Because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonist of this story. M.